Welcome to Pasa, HSIs, a podcast dedicated to everything Hispanic serving institutions. I'm your host, Dr. Gina Ann Garcia, bringing you the news on what's happening in HSIs. Join us as we explore the history and evolution of HSIs, culturally relevant and liberatory practices, current and emerging research with HSIs, and the policies that shape servingness.
Saludos HSI familia, and welcome back to Que Pasa HSIs, and welcome to season 6. Today we are going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is the idea of HSIs producing liberatory outcomes. Since I started doing HSI research in 2010, I have consistently argued that graduation rates could not be the sole indicator of being a good HSI. Back then, the HSI research and policy reports were basically saying that if you graduate Latine students equitably, you're a good HSI. As a doctoral student in a higher education program and a quantitative researcher in training, that didn't sit well with me because graduation rates are often predicted by variables uncontrolled by the college or university. So if you throw a bunch of variables into a quantitative model to predict likelihood of graduation from a college or even from high school, variables like income, mother's education level, and high school of origin will come out as positive predictors. We see those predictors over and over again coming up. But as an HSI researcher, I have focused on holding the institutions accountable for servingness, which means we accept students as they arrive, including their income, their mother's education level, and the high school they attended, and educate them regardless. So I wanted to hold HSIs accountable for more than graduation rates, since there are many factors that go into those rates. I also wanted HSIs to acknowledge that when you add some other variables, like whether or not a student took an ethnic studies class, for example, you also see an increase. And I wanted HSIs to focus on those variables that they can control. Fast forward to the multidimensional conceptual framework for understanding servingness, which was published in 2019. My colleagues and I saw that non-academic variables were coming up in the HSI research as important dimensions of being an HSI. For example, students feeling validated when speaking Spanish on campus with faculty, staff, and peers was reported in early HSI research. Shout out to Laura Rendon for telling us that validation matters for over 30 years now. We know that. We know validation matters. We also saw people like my friend Juan Guardia writing about how students at HSIs had an increase in their racial ethnic identity development. So we added, quote unquote, literally quote unquote, non-academic outcomes as an indicator of servingness. Now, this aligned nicely with my training as a student affairs practitioner, where I had learned that non-academic outcomes, again, quote unquote, matter to students' development. But as soon as that article was published, I regretted our decision to call them non-academic variables because they are in fact academic. Things like racial ethnic identity development, critical consciousness, social justice orientation, political activism, all of those can be developed in both academic and non-academic settings. But at a university, we consider all of them academic spaces for the most part. So around the time the article was published, I was in a meeting with Dr. Sheila Radford Hill, and I must have been complaining about how we called these variables non-academic. And she suggested that those variables might be liberatory, a concept I had also been pushing in the HSI research, including justice and liberation. So shout out to Dr. Radford Hill for providing me with that insight. The rest is pretty much history. I've been pushing liberatory outcomes ever since, and people are buying it. But that question always comes up: how do you measure liberatory outcomes? And so that's what today's topic of conversation is going to be, along with some other servingness topics, of course. So today's show, we are joined by our guest, Dr. Patrick Velasquez, who is the co-chair of San Diego Chicano Latino Concilio on higher education, a 30-year organization of educators that advocates for access and success among Chicano Latino students in the San Diego region. The San Diego Concilio's advocacy includes research, reports, position papers, media essays, video pláticas, and meetings with college and university officials. Dr. Velasquez is a Chicano educator born and raised in the Midwest and the grandson of immigrants from Central Mexico. He has worked in the nonprofit sector and in university settings, including work as the student affairs manager and a lecturer in the education studies department at UC San Diego. As a co-chair of the San Diego Concilio, he serves on San Diego State University's HSI Advisory Committee, which successfully advocated for the addition of an undergraduate liberatory institutional learning outcome that emphasizes anti-racism and social justice for SDSU students. So I invited Dr. Velasquez here today to talk about it. Dr. Velasquez, welcome to Que Pasa HSIs, where we talk about all things HSIs. But first, we're going to talk about what brings you into HSI research. So let's start with our first question, all the guests answer, which is, what is your servingness journey?
Yeah, for me, it started as a university undergraduate. As you said, I'm from the Midwest, and I went to the University of Nebraska campus in Omaha, Nebraska. And I went there without any sense of direction. I went 2 years without a major, didn't really know what I wanted to do with my college education or my life. And it wasn't until I took courses, academic courses in sociology and social work. I became a social work major. And I also took some of the few Black Studies courses and Chicano Studies courses that the university offered at that time. I remember reading an article by a few scholars, Chicano scholars, a couple of them that worked for a long time on your campus in Berkeley, Carlos Munoz and Mario Barrera. And they collaborated on an article called The Barrio as an Internal Colony. And that was the first time I thought about how society is structured socially, economically, etc. I'd never thought about the United States having a racial hierarchy or socioeconomic or gender hierarchy, and the way that those hierarchical conditions structured opportunities in Chicano communities like the one where I grew up. So that had a big impact on me. I declared a social work major. I also became involved then with the campus Chicano student organization, which was the most impactful experience I had as a college student. And through that, I started to build my ethnic identity. And I think that's what really made me completely flip my perception of college education. That to me, it was no longer about just getting a job and making money, but trying to be a change agent for the Chicano community. And as one of my graduate school mentors used to say, to try to improve the human condition. And from there, it just continued. But that was the early start for me.
Yes, I feel that. Very similar story as far as like ethnic studies sort of being like such a pivotal moment, right? Like such an important moment for so many of us, right? That where we get to like start to see ourselves in the curriculum and start to like understand, right? Understand history, or maybe history that was taught to us that wasn't always accurate, right? Is told from one dominant perspective. For me, it was Rudy Acuna, the
Yes.
godfather of Chicano studies, of course, right? He was at
Mhm.
Cal State University Northridge, and I took a class with him, and I had no idea who he was at that time. Now I do, obviously, but everybody wanted to be in that class, and I was like, okay. Somehow I lucked out and I got in the class. I had early registration, and yeah, definitely lucked out. And that was an important moment, right? To have that, to be able to take that course, and to read Occupied America, right, for the first time. So yeah, for sure. So you obviously then didn't attend an HSI.
No, the University of Nebraska at that time was probably about 2% Chicano Latino, and almost no Chicano faculty. We could count them on one hand, and again, very few Chicano studies courses. So it was a really a different kind of struggle.
So when did it first come into your consciousness, like Hispanic Servant Institution? When did you first hear about that and or start thinking about it?
I think I had always been intrigued by the idea of something like a Chicano alternative school or a Chicano educational institution. In the 1970s, I had an opportunity to go to Denver, Colorado, and visit the Crusade for Justice that was run by Corky Gonzalez. And at that time, the Crusade had a preschool, elementary school, secondary school, and even offered university courses. And that was what really made me think about the idea of Chicano schools. I later on heard about DQ University in Davis, California. And so this idea was in my head well before I ever heard the term HSI. When I started my doctoral program, I had all my faculty were great, but on my dissertation committee, I had Dr. Antonia Darder, who was a very powerful Puerto Rican woman, and also had Daryl Smith, who's an outstanding scholar of
Mm-hmm.
higher education.
Mm-hmm.
So again, they didn't use the language of HSIs, but they talked about the importance of institutional conditions. When I was working on my dissertation, Antonia helped me use her framework of what she called cultural democracy, which was a way of, again, constructing an institution with supportive educational conditions for all students. And so I started to think about something like that. Daryl Smith also had a lot of focus in her research on, I think, what she called single purpose institutions. So historically black colleges and universities, women's colleges and universities, and the kinds of dynamics, the conditions that they achieved, and they weren't, again, using the term like validation as Rendon would do later, but I still think talking about the same things. When I was also at UC San Diego, I was there when Dr. Frances Contreras came to UCSD, and had several conversations with her, read her book and some of her articles, and I think her work was the first one I saw that utilized um, the term HSI, and made me think about that and how we might be able to
Mm-hmm.
construct HSIs that were similar to the kinds of institutions we'd always sort of romanticized about.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So these like scholar giants, right? I would say, right? People who
Hmm.
have been writing about this kind of stuff for a long time. And it's interesting the people you're naming, I'm like, yes, those are people that like like Antonia Darder, right? Like talking about servingness the way I talk about it, but not calling it servingness, right? Like we've been talking about this concept.
Hmm.
But now bringing all of these things that like there's a history of research on this idea of servingness that we're pulling into HSI and say, well, how do HSIs do what has been documented in research for decades already, right? We've
Hmm.
had, like I said, scholar giants, right, who have been documented. Like I shouted out Laura Rendon, right? Same thing. Like she's been talking about this stuff for 30 years and we're still at the same point of saying, yes, validation matters, right? Like,
Yeah.
so yeah, absolutely. DQ, by the way, that's an interesting
Hmm.
institution. I want to say the only tribal college in California and was shut down, right? Like I
I
know
believe so.
they closed down,
Mhm.
but I know they were the first tribal college in California, but I think the only one that ever was even established in California, and unfortunately closed its doors.
Right.
Um, which happens to MSIs, but we need to lift up DQ University and learn even about the history
Mhm.
of it. I have my students in my history class learn about DQ.
Yeah, I remember reading about an institution called National Hispanic University. I think that was in Oakland,
Hmm.
and I'm pretty sure it's not around anymore. It hasn't been for a long time. But again, those, at least the ideas were important, and I think it still fuels some of the work that we do.
Yeah. Yes, that was one of the original HSIs as well, established as an HSI that shut down. Boricua College and Hostos College would be the other two in New York,
Hmm.
which are still alive, right? They're still doing well. But yeah, the California institutions that were established have shut down. So we know that's a reality too,
Hmm.
which is different than this idea that we talk about, which is this process of becoming, right? Like you work closely with San Diego State University, right? Like becoming an HSI versus
Yes.
being established as one. Awesome. Well, let's talk about the San Diego Chicano Latino Concilio on higher education, an organization that advocates for access and success among Chicano Latino students in the San Diego region. The organization is what I call an external influence on servingness. And that's how it would be framed in the servingness framework. And I'm excited to learn more because I don't always get to talk to folks that are sort of on the external influence. And I think there's a lot of influence that comes external to the university, and we should be responding right to those. So tell us about the San Diego Concilio and the work that y'all do.
Yeah. First of all, I would say that it is a very different approach and different voice. I worked at UC San Diego for 28 years, and it was almost impossible to make any change internally there. They simply would not listen to internal voices. And so our concilio is very much an external sort of voice and an entity. And as you mentioned in the introduction, we've been around for about 30 years now. And our primary responsibility is to monitor the conditions in the local public institutions of higher education in San Diego. So within San Diego County, we have one UC institution, University of California, San Diego. We have two CSUs, and we have 8 community colleges. So again, we're trying to maintain a role of monitoring the conditions for Chicanos in those institutions, and also to provide advocacy and make specific recommendations for change when we feel it's merited. Um, we have a website with a number of position papers that we issue, essays that we've written, reports that look at the local institutions. And we also have a YouTube channel. And so, what we're really trying to do, I would say, is try to maintain consciousness within the Chicano community itself of the role of higher educations. What I have often sensed, Gina, is that for many Chicanos, and I understand this, that when their students make it to the door of college, they often feel like the struggle is over then, that they've been successful just to get them to the door. When in fact,
Mm,
the struggle really starts at that point, as you know. And the
mhm.
kinds of conditions and experiences that students have will help to determine if they graduate or not, and the way that they graduate, the kinds of knowledges and skills and sensibilities they have. So we're trying to continually look at these public higher education institutions and help them to enact the kind of changes that you write about. We just had our last San Diego Concilio meeting in late December, and two of the priorities that we decided to take on in 2025, one is to really push our local institutions to do everything they possibly can to protect undocumented and mixed status students and their families in the coming year and beyond. But certainly, we all know what the intentions are of the new presidential administration, and so we have to be
Mhm.
ready for that, and we expect our post secondary institutions to be ready and begin to support our students and their families. The other thing we sense is that students, particularly Chicano students, are starting to get the impression that maybe college is not for everybody, or that it's not worth the work and the financial investment. So we're going to try to undertake a campaign to continue to raise consciousness about the benefits of a college education, and as well as what the process itself is. So it's interesting. In many ways, we're still struggling for the same kinds of gains that we were seeking 30 years ago when we start. But I think those are the important things. Again, they're reflected in your work and in all the
Mhm.
precursors to your work.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. Ooh, the precursors. Yes, that part. That's a good way to say it. Okay. I agree. Thank you for bringing in the fact that in 2025, we need to be ready, right? We
Mhm,
need to be like all of us, everyone listening, all the listeners at Get Pasa HSIs who are advocating for and pushing for change on HSIs. We need to be ready for whatever is going to come at us,
mhm,
because we know this new administration is going to try to dismantle things that matter to us, right?
mhm,
Things like ethnic studies, things like diversity requirements, things like HSIs, right?
mhm,
That these are all going to be things that we're going to have to be much louder for, right? And
yeah,
organizations like yours, like the San Diego Concilio, is going to be having to lead some of those ways, right? And help us to think about, right? Like I keep asking, okay, who's going to organize, right? Who's going to be the leader? Who's going to
mhm.
organize this? And I think we're going to need a lot of organizers in
Yeah,
different places.
we've seen that from our conversations. We're seeing that most of the post-secondary institutions in San Diego, they have a Dreamer Center or a Center for Undocumented Students.
Mm,
But
mm,
most of them are on soft money. They're not adequately staffed. They don't necessarily receive the kind of institutional support that they deserve. So again, our external voice has to support them. We know that they will fight and they will advocate from the inside, but we're going to try to do everything we can to support their efforts.
yes. Oh yeah, those are definitely spaces we have to be thinking about protecting, particularly in California. We know there's a day one threat, right? To
Mm-hmm.
like we're gonna start mass deportation, and those are going to be spaces that are going to have to, do a lot of advocacy. And also we need to think about how we protect those spaces. So a lot of work ahead of us. So let's talk about the main topic of today's show, which is this idea of liberatory outcomes. How do you define liberatory outcomes?
I would say it's mainly, in a nutshell, it's knowledge, but also sensibilities or attitudes, the knowledge and sensibilities that students need to acquire in order to become informed leaders, engaged leaders, and change agents for their own communities. So I've never supported this idea of getting out of the barrio and not looking back. I think this goes back to the Plan de Santa Barbara in 1969, I believe, where
Mm-hmm.
the framers wrote about the idea of a university being for the people. And so it's not just to enhance the economy. This is what we hear all the time in San Diego, that people who make the case that we need more resources for higher education is only because that they support the economy, they fuel the economy. That's a piece of it, sure, but from our perspective in the Chicano community, we expect our public institutions to help our young folks, our students, to develop again the knowledge and sensibilities that will enable them to come back to the community or to remain in the community and to provide that sort of voice that leads to collective change. We don't agree with the whole model of individual mobility through higher education, at least for our population, as a subordinate group in the racial hierarchy of the United States. We have to pursue a more collective approach.
Absolutely, for sure.
And I think you've written so much about specifically what those liberatory outcomes are. I've been interested in the research on ethnic identity for 30 or 40 years now, and I can remember books published in the 1970s by scholars like Alfredo Castañeda, Manuel Ramirez, who talked about cultural democracy way back then, and cultural inclusion, inclusive pedagogy. And so, ethnic identity, biculturalism, commitment to social justice, anti racism, those are the sorts of specific liberatory outcomes we were able to get embedded in this new institutional learning outcome at San Diego State.
Yes. Ooh, so let's talk about that. Actually, before we do that, I wanted to ask you, and you've said a little bit of this, but like
Mhm.
what sort of bodies of research? Because I actually send people to bodies of research when thinking about the liberatory outcomes. I'm like, oh, look into like Paulo Freire, right? Like,
Yeah.
what bodies of research like inform your definition of liberatory outcomes? And or like how has your, work in student in ethnic studies and student affairs influenced some of your thinking around that?
Yeah, again, going way back, the first things that I read were publications from the 1970s by people like Ramirez and Castañeda. And I remember two volumes. The first one, I think, published in 1974, and the second one 10 years later, that were called Chicano Psychology. And so these were not higher education scholarship works per se, but a lot of the elements and dimensions of what these scholars wrote about could be applied to the educational area. So people like Amado Padilla, who was a psychologist at Stanford for a long time, that he wrote about biculturalism and did a study, I know at one point, looking at bicultural students at Stanford and how biculturalism contributed to their success in a very competitive educational environment. And then I would say again, the people that were on my dissertation committee, Antonio Darder's book, Culture and Power in the Classroom, I think the first edition in 1991 and then the second edition around 2011, that had a big influence on me, particularly about biculturalism, but also, again, how institutional conditions have to support students. Daryl Smith's book, Diversity's Promise for Higher Education, is a very important one. And I think almost any of the work of somebody I know you're very familiar with, Silvia Hurtado, who I had the pleasure of working with a little bit at UC San Diego.
Yeah, I
And
know her.
yeah, I'm sure you do. Yeah, all the work that she did and the theoretical models
Mhm.
that she developed that not only include the processes and again the campus racial climate and all the elements of that affect students' experiences. Um, yeah, so those I think were some of the most prominent influences. I would encourage people to read those and get a better sense of what liberatory outcomes are and where they come from. Your
Yes, for
your
sure.
work of your work, of course, I think brings everything in. So and if I might say, Gina, the one thing that I'm really always loved about your work is the fact that you're not afraid to call out racism and even to use the word racism. And I found some Chicano scholars that won't do that.
Mm, mm,
They'll talk about the
mhm.
symptoms of racism, or the symptoms of being a subordinate group in a racial hierarchy. But we do need to call it out as you've done, and in terms like the coloniality of power and so forth.
Hmm.
And I think that makes it that more real and much more authentic.
Yes, for sure. Oh yeah, I've never had trouble. Uh, truth telling, I say I'm gonna tell it like it is, y'all. Truth telling, right? Because yeah, if we don't call it out, how are we gonna talk about it, right?
That's
How are
right.
we gonna disrupt it if we can't even name it, right? And
Yeah.
actually call it what it is. So but yes, I concur, I second, I retweet whatever we're saying now, to like, yes, all those folks you named,
Hmm.
and others. Like I said, I definitely, I always say, talk about Paulo Freire, like he's just so foundational in liberatory pedagogy, right? Like we
Hmm.
all have read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, for sure. Bell Hooks, right? Those are like folks who have like wrote about this, decades ago. And so, yeah, there's a lot of just good foundational work
Hmm.
in thinking about liberatory outcomes. Like it's not, I didn't make it up, right? We're naming all this, like lots of research that has been happening. I just gave it a title and said HSI should do it. That's all, right? But we've been doing it. First
Hmm.
of all, there's that. We've been producing liberatory outcomes, right? I just call on HSIs to be more intentional about it,
That's
right?
important. Yes.
That's what's important about it. So yeah, let's talk about the SDSU work, because y'all are one of the first, but I know you also are in contact with other folks doing this work across the nation. So we can talk about that too. But to really push for this idea of making sure that it's at the university level. So
Hmm.
while serving on the San Diego State University HSI Advisory Committee, you were on the Student Success, Academic, and Liberatory Outcomes Subcommittee, where you recommended that, and I'm going to read it exactly, SDSU should continue to develop, maintain, and refine an institution-wide assessment strategy that includes academic affairs and, I assume, SACD is student affairs?
Yeah. Student affairs and campus diversity is the
And campus
division.
diversity.
Mhm.
Okay. SACD, respectively. SDSU should add an institutional learning outcome to reflect the liberatory outcomes identified by me, right, by Dr. Garcia.
Mhm.
And on May 7, 2024, you learned that a liberatory ILO, institutional learning outcome, was approved. So tell us about that work and how you were successful in getting that approved.
Yeah, there's a lot of context to it. I would say prior to about 2019 or so, our San Diego Concilio had met with the leadership of San Diego State regularly, but we really didn't get very far. And we tried to push them to think about what it means to actualize HSI status, because at a certain point, they bragged a lot about being an HSI without really doing anything to change their institutional conditions. So what changed, I think, was the appointment of a Chicana as president of San Diego State in about 2019 or so. And that was Adela de la Torre, who's still president there. Adela is not only a very down to earth Chicana, but her academic field is Chicana and Chicano studies. So, we had come from this long history of meeting with the leadership of San Diego State, in which we had to take 20 or 30 minutes just to explain to them what Chicanos are. And so we didn't have to do any of this with Dr. De La Torre, President De La Torre. So we met with her, and we again asked the question, how will you actualize HSI status? And as we talked it through, she agreed to convene a task force on HSI status at San Diego State. So I was a part of that. Several of our Concilio members were a part of it, along with the faculty, staff, and students of San Diego State. You probably don't remember this because it was a long time ago, and I know that you visit so many places, but I remember we did a Zoom call with you at about that time, and they were encouraging us to read your work, your first book, I think it was out at that point. And so we decided, one of the recommendations we made at the task force was that the task force, there's some form of it, should be made permanent. And so that was the HSI advisory group that still exists. We also recommended the establishment of an HSI office at San Diego State, which they also did. And so they now have a full-time director, Emilio Ulloa, who is director of HSI affairs at San Diego State. I've served now, I think, for 3 years on the subcommittee of the advisory group that looks at assessment primarily. Our title is Academic and Liberatory Affairs and Student Success, or Outcomes, I should say. And so you mentioned the recommendations that we made a couple of years ago. And at that point, I think, or maybe 3 years ago, Gina, San Diego State wasn't really doing any systematic assessment in any of its divisions. So there was no requirement for academic departments to do assessments of learning. There was no requirement for student affairs units to do assessment. So we recommended that, and I think they were already headed that direction because they knew that in 2025 they were going to have their next accreditation review. And they had been dinged from the past review for not having sufficient assessment. So we shaped this recommendation trying to say that both academic affairs and student affairs and campus diversity should do um, thorough assessments. And we also called for an assessment of the campus climate using Silvia Hurtado's framework. That unfortunately was never done. We found out about very recently some new institutional learning outcomes that are part of the undergraduate catalog there. So they're required of all San Diego State
Mhm.
undergraduates. They had one that we felt was very weak that talked about multiculturalism to some extent, but it was really weak and even incorporated international affairs in a way that would have let, I think, too many people off the hook and not having to deal with racism or any of the experiences of underrepresented communities in the United States. So we wrote this different institutional learning outcome, and Emilio, again the director of HSI Affairs, he really did all the groundwork of taking this proposal, this proposed outcome, through all the different committees, administrative committees like the Council of Academic Deans, the Council of Assistant Deans, all the different academic senate committees, including the Committee on DEI. And eventually, in May of 2024, the Academic Senate as a whole approved it. So it now basically takes the place of this last institutional learning outcome that they had. So we feel real good about that. I think it's a pretty groundbreaking event, but the work is really just going to start now because the question becomes how will academic departments, how will student affairs units measure this outcome? And I'm not sure that the expertise is there
Mm.
to really make that happen. So that's going to be a continued struggle, to say the least.
Yes. Ooh. And I mean, it's already been a whole process, right? But the
Mhm.
process is still like so much more extensive. But I appreciate you giving us all the background because I am like a huge advocate of having HSI advisory committees, right? You know, because you've heard me speak before.
Mhm.
I always, at every campus I visit, I'm like, you have, if you don't have a committee, that's your job. I've actually told presidents in my public lecture, your homework assignment is to assign an agent to come up and appoint an HSI advisory committee.
Mhm.
And presidents have told me like no speakers ever assigned me a task in the middle of the talk. I'm like, that's how I am,
Mhm.
right? I'm gonna keep it real. I'm gonna say what it is, right? But those committees can only there's a lot of work that has to go into that committee, right? And whether or not they actually are successful.
Right.
To outline for us, right, the like process of even getting to something that's really exciting like this is important, right? That we know that, okay, we want to do this, but it's going to take time. And how do we get it through academic senate?
Mhm.
Right. Like that's huge when it comes to the curriculum side of the HSI transformation work is like, you're going to have your academic senate on board. Otherwise it's not going anywhere.
Yes.
They have to approve it. So I assume y'all had some advocates there, right? Or had connections, right? Like with people there to make sure that it got passed through them.
Yeah, there's some excellent faculty of color at San Diego State, very committed folks, and that's part of their commitment is that they're active in the academic senate. They take on leadership roles in the senate, and without their support and very vocal advocacy, this would have never happened. And, I have to emphasize too that San Diego State's going through another process right now where they are trying to become and will become a Research One institution.
Mm.
And and
Mm-hmm.
and Gina, as a Californian, the CSUs have a teaching mission,
Mm-hmm.
and San Diego State has always been a teaching institution.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the points that we've raised is how are you going to become a Research One institution without diluting your emphasis on teaching and learning. So
Yes.
getting this ILO on the books and a part of official institutional policy, I think will help us to leverage that kind of effort. At least we hope so.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I know that's been a lot of your advocacy work as well, which is interesting. And I'm sure we'll see articles come out about that. I don't know if you're familiar with UT San Antonio. They
Mhm.
went through the same process of like striving for tier one. And several scholars have written about the tensions that come up, right, about HSI versus striving for tier one, right? And
Right.
what do you lose when you're striving so hard? And what kind of pressures are you putting on your faculty who are so committed to the community, to teaching, right? To the Latine students that are here, yet you're putting pressure on them to do something else, right? Which wasn't what they came for.
Right. Right. My nightmare is San Diego State becoming like UC San Diego. And I mean, you're at a
Mm,
UC, you know, Berkeley's probably a lot better in that sense than UCSD. But having been at that institution for so long, there's a minimal emphasis on teaching and learning there. There's again
mm,
virtually no assessment that takes
mm.
place of learning, especially in academic affairs. So there's so many negatives that can occur in that process, and so hopefully that won't be the case at San Diego State. Again, if the leadership stays in place and a lot of the faculty don't leave, then I think we have a good chance.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So you also recommended that quote unquote SDSU's assessment of all learning outcomes disaggregated by ethnicity to allow for analysis of outcomes for Chicanx, Latinx students should be reported annually to the HSI Advisory Committee, including the HSI Student Success Academic and Liberatory Outcomes Subcommittee. So was that recommendation also approved?
Absolutely not. I mean, and this is part of the frustration. Before I give San Diego State too much credit, part of the frustration is the lack of a definitive institutional response to our recommendations. And so I'm sure this happens all over the country in higher education. Again, it happened to me ad nauseum at UCSD, where people will be convened to study an issue, make recommendations, issue a report, and that report doesn't go anywhere except to gather dust somewhere. So when we made our recommendations, and we were just one subcommittee, there were several other subcommittees that made recommendations at the same time. And when we submitted them, my understanding was that they would go to the vice president of student affairs and campus diversity. They would go to the provost who oversees academic affairs, and then ultimately they would go to the president. We even talked about some kind of town hall where those administrators would all be present along with the academic senate leadership. We would formally present the recommendations and there would be dialogue. And unfortunately, none of that has happened. So I'm not sure what the reluctance is from the leadership to again issue some kind of definitive response that yes, either we think this is a good idea or we don't think it's a good idea. They pretty much just left it up to the advisory group to try to get things done any way that we can. And again, that worked okay with getting our institutional learning outcome approved, but even something as basic as saying, "Hey, we want to know every year how our Chicano students are doing. What is their status?" They do have a very good um, unit that does institutional research. So it's never been a problem at San Diego State to get data on Chicano student graduation rates, 1 year retention, the retention of transfer students and first year freshmen and so forth, students on probation by ethnicity, all those sorts of things we can get. But when it comes to assessments of learning, there just doesn't seem to be a stomach for that. I
Mm,
do know that again, this is pretty new to both divisions at San Diego State, and the system that they're using in academic affairs is a challenge, I think, for some of the faculty that have never really been required to do this before. So, at the risk of being impatient or overly impatient, we're going to continue to try to push.
yeah, for that. I mean, it's an important piece, and it's interesting that I mean, we know there's always going to be these barriers and these challenges, and that's some of the people that ask me about how to measure liberatory outcomes tend to be from institutional research offices.
Mm,
So I don't know if y'all have any institutional research folks on your committee and if they've thought about it, but I get that a lot, right? Or at the community colleges, institutional effectiveness, right? Folks that will come up to me after like my public lecture and be like, "This is really great, and I love this idea." And we don't have any of these measures, right? Like, we don't collect these data, right? And we know that.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reality. We don't collect these data, which brings up also a couple different things. Is there's levels to it, because I talk about this at the classroom level, right? Faculty have to address these ILOs. So how are faculty going to measure at the classroom level,
Mm-hmm.
right? First, and then at the institutional level, which would be our institutional research, institutional effectiveness people would come in there, right? Where they want the institutional level outcomes, right? Measure. So,
Mm-hmm.
so I think there's that too, right? That there's these layers of like, well, we could recommend stuff for faculty, but then also what is that going to look like at the institutional level to say we're actually producing this outcome along with graduation, right? That's always my thing. It's like, we could produce both.
Right. Yeah. And I've seen, again, this is complex, and I don't mean to understate the complexity, but it's not just the liberatory outcome at San Diego State that we're concerned about. I don't even know to what extent academic departments are assessing all their other institutional learning outcomes, which are they're pretty standard. To me, pretty innocuous. Quantitative skills, communication skills, critical thinking skills. So I'm not sure what direction or guidance they're really getting, and what kind of progress they're making. There is a bit of a leadership void in academic affairs at San Diego State right now, in the sense that their previous provost, who was a Chicano, he left, and so he was part of the exodus of folks from California to Texas. He went to Texas, and so the provost position has been filled on an interim basis the last 2 years. My understanding is by fall they should have a new provost, and hopefully that person knows about assessment and can provide more leadership.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So the struggle continues.
Yes.
That's the general case with HSIs, right? Even the wins, like you celebrate them. This is a exciting win, right? I think it's amazing. I loved hearing that this progress was made. Several people told me about it, right? But then we still keep going, right?
Yes.
There's more. La lucha sigue. So let's keep going. I am going to go ahead and refer people to your website. I hope that people will listen. It will be available on the show notes, because y'all have written some pretty phenomenal reports. So if y'all listening want to hear more about this, I am going to ask you about one of the reports, because the most downloaded episode of our 2024 season was about decolonizing HSIs. And so I want to bring that topic up, because y'all have written about that, right? The San Diego Concilio has written about that. So in 2022, you published a report called The Status of San Diego Chicano Latinos in Public Higher Education, Decolonizing Local Colleges and Universities, in which you cite my work heavily. I appreciate that. I always appreciate that. So tell us about the report. And it seems like you have a series on decolonizing colleges and universities.
Well, the report was something we initially asked all these public institutions to do. That we our sort of maybe naive thought was that this sort of data that would indicate the status of Chicano students in their institutions, they should be right on top of that. If somebody asked them, how are Chicano students doing, my expectation would be they'd be able to say, well, let me tell you, we've already got a report that we do every year, and here it is. But there was no inclination, after we had a dialogue with most of the institution's leadership. They weren't inclined to do any kind of a report on our community students. So we decided to do the report ourselves. And we focused on the principle of decolonization, because we wanted to really emphasize the point that when we talk about Chicano students, it's not just cultural differences or ethnic difference, but again, that this is a subordinate community that comes out of a long history of racism and dealing with racism and resisting racism. And the task of transforming really institutions is to decolonize them. And as you've talked about, to eliminate um, incidences and structures of racism throughout the institution. So we use that kind of language in order to emphasize also the fact that we were not looking for minor reforms, but actual transformation of the colleges and universities. So we identified 6 indicators that we wanted to look at. And we asked all these institutions, again, 11 public institutions, to give us data on these 6 indicators that included leadership and institutional mission, the enrollment of Chicano students, the success and the support for Chicano students via programs like Puente, which are so often under-resourced, even though they're
Mm-hmm.
model programs of success. We also looked at the representation of diverse faculty, diverse curriculum, support for Chicano and Chicano studies or ethnic studies. And another indicator that we wanted to look at, which is a fairly recent focus for us, it is emphasized in your book, and that's the way that law enforcement is carried out on college campuses.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And the logic was that if there's over policing and racism in the law enforcement in our communities, it's going to be in our public institutions as well. And we also had members of our concilio that work at universities like San Diego State or community colleges in San Diego. And they shared with us the amount of the budget, the institutional budget that's spent on law enforcement. And in many cases, it's outrageous. So we
Mm-hmm.
tried to tap into that. That was the one area where most of the campuses were very reluctant or even refused to give us data about the amount of money they were spending on law enforcement or the way that it was carried out. So we issued the report. We followed it up with Zoom meetings with every single institution's leadership within the 6 months following the issuing of the report, with the exception of UC San Diego, which has unfortunately no sense of accountability to our community and really doesn't have any willingness to meet with us. So, but we've had these dialogues, and I think we've established some relationships that hopefully will lead to change. I think we're encouraged by the fact that almost every year we see more Chicano faculty entering these institutions, and in some
Mm-hmm.
cases we see more Chicano leadership um, becoming presidents or board members of community colleges. So we made some progress, but again, the key to advocacy is persistence. And so we have to be like a pit bull and continue to hold on and shake the leg as much as possible. And we've also, Gina, tried to work to some degree with elected officials. I've been very heartened by the response of one of the California Assembly members in San Diego, David Alvarez. And in many ways, David exemplifies liberatory outcomes. David was raised in Barrio Logan in San Diego, working class
Mm-hmm.
Chicano community. He graduated from San Diego State. He served on the San Diego City Council for years. Now he's in the California Assembly, and he's been trying to lead some efforts to improve educational changes for Chicanos at all levels. And again, I think it was because of the sort of education that he had and the experiences that produced these liberatory outcomes that make him a change agent. So
Mm-hmm.
on the whole, though, I've been very, very disappointed over the years in the absolute lack of response from the so-called Hispanic Legislative Caucus in the
Mm-hmm.
Senate and Assembly. Um, the organization is not even accessible to groups like our Concilio, and I don't see what they're doing given the amount of leverage that they have, the political power that they have. And sometimes it seems like the public education institutions, particularly the UCs, are leading them rather than having them be the people that press for changes in the UCs.
Yes. Oh, I love that last part about working with officials and some of our own homegrown officials. I
Mm-hmm.
think about that as serving us as well,
Mm-hmm.
and written a little bit about it. Like I wrote a blog post about like we should be thinking about how we're training future legislators, future politicians, Congress people, judges, police officers. Right?
Yes.
Like we're training some future police officers. Why aren't we holding ourselves accountable for training people who are justice oriented, right? Like and that's part of this learning outcomes thing, right? Is like
Mm-hmm.
if we committed to that, then we are, right? We can say we are training folks that are going to be committed to this stuff so that when they do make it into these positions, they don't forget about us, and those Hispanic caucuses don't just do some work outside of what we're doing, right? Like
Yes.
they're there, but they're not actually supporting us.
Right. And one of the things I wanted to emphasize was the tension that I've seen over the years in San Diego in virtually all the public higher education institutions, and that's the reluctance of folks in the STEM field to embrace liberatory outcomes. And I saw again this at UCSD for years. I still see it in San Diego, where institutions are willing to put resources into STEM programs, in STEM services, and they're willing to pursue grants to try to get more Chicanos into STEM programs. But there's no leadership development. There's no emphasis on liberatory outcomes, no development of a social consciousness. And that is not the way that the Chicano community will progress collectively, by having folks that, put on a white coat and work in a lab all day, and they don't know how to be politically or engaged in their community, or to serve as change agents. So trying to get folks in the STEM field on this side is going to be very difficult. It'll be interesting at San Diego State to see how the STEM folks enact any kind of measures of liberatory outcomes.
Yeah. Oh, STEM. I'm like, that's the area I think we need it more than anywhere. I always
Hmm.
think about engineers. I'm like, engineers, like we need socially just critically conscious engineers, right?
Hmm.
Engineers are building our systems, engineers that are studying, climate issues, right? Climate change, are building bridges, right? Like are addressing water, right? Like water systems, right?
Hmm.
That matter to our communities that don't have sufficient water, right? Going into communities, like if we have people that were trained in this way, right, with that, through that lens of like liberation and justice, how powerful, right,
Yeah,
that would be. And
it,
that's who we need to be thinking about,
yeah, it's
right?
essential. It's essential.
The folks who go out there and serve, or even in the STEM majors, they're training folks who are pre med, right? You talk about San Diego, UC San Diego, right? Like people there that are pre med, that are going to eventually be our doctors and our nurses, right? Our physicians, people who should be critically conscious, and I advocate a hard on this one, and bilingual at this
Hmm.
point,
Yes.
right? We need bilingual medical professionals. All right, we a small percentage are, I think, is what, like something like 6%. And I may be overstating, of our physicians are Latine identified. And how many of patients, right, in the area like San Diego?
Hmm.
Probably a majority of the population, right, that's going in and needing treatment and needing to be served in their languages and in through bicultural lenses, right?
Hmm.
Um, and these are all things HSIs can take up. These are
Yeah.
all things HSIs can say,
Yes.
this is what it means to be an HSI.
Yes. Again, at UC San Diego, I work with countless medical students over the year, pre-med
Mm.
students, and there
Mm-hmm.
was no requirement for those students to take ethnic studies courses or any sort of
Mm-mm.
diversity courses. And how can you be a functioning doctor in California when over 40% of the population is Latino,
Yeah.
and over 50% of the school-age children are Latino? So, yeah, it's been an area that's been neglected for far too long.
Right. Talk about calling out racism. Medical racism is real, right? We know
Hmm.
Black African Americans in this country are dying at higher rates, right? Women die at higher rates in like birth, right? And like childbirth, right? Things like that matter. We need to be talking about that, right?
Yes.
And HSI should be the places where we should be doing that. So we're going to keep talking about it here, on the podcast and in other places, and feed. I think of the podcast as fueling the movement, right? I call
Mhm.
it the HSI movement. This is fueling the movement. People listen, get ideas, think, yeah, I agree with that. I agree with what y'all talking about, right? And bring it back to their campuses. So thank you for being with me today, on Que Pasa HSIs, to have this conversation. Before you get out of the podcast, everybody has to answer the question, which is the name of the show, ¿Qué pasa, HSI? So when you hear that question, what is your response?
Lo que está pasando with HSIs? Again, I think it's. I used to talk with students in our summer bridge program at UC San Diego. I taught in that program for a long time, and so we were working with students that just were out of high school, underrepresented students of color, almost all of them. And we talked about the principle of the dialectic, and the fact that even when oppression seems very powerful, there's always resistance. And so I see a lot of challenges for us ahead going forward in higher education, challenges trying to build really truly serving HSIs. But I think, again, there's potential. I think we are making some gains, and in the increases in Chicano Latino faculty and in curriculum. And so I'm still optimistic about the future.
Awesome. Me too. I think that's why we get along so much. I remain optimistic. We
You
got
have
to keep
to.
going. We got to keep fighting, but
Mhm.
we got to also remain optimistic. So
Yeah, you have to.
thank you so much, Patrick, for being here with me today on Que Pasa HSIs.
Thank you, Gina. My pleasure.